Hi, and thank you for tuning into Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Unforgivable Blackness. Unforgivable Blackness is a 2005 sports documentary that charted the life and career of the first black heavyweight champion. The film explores how the rise of Jack Johnson was met with fierce resistance that led to the search for a great white hope. Directed by Ken Burns and narrated by Keith David, as well as Samuel L. Jackson, the movie details Johnson's prowess in the ring and unapologetic demeanor in his personal life. John Arthur Johnson was born shortly after the end of Reconstruction in Galveston, Texas, to parents who were former slaves. With many having been denied the opportunity to learn, most of the newly freed placed a high value in education. Thus, his parents made sure that all 6 of their children got at least a basic education and could read and write. Johnson would only obtain 5 years of formal education, but had big dreams and saw himself as being special. Having a dream to get up and out of humble circumstances has fueled a lot of people's quest for greatness. By the time Johnson reached his late teens, he was rather large, standing at 6 feet tall, with a powerful muscular build making him a good candidate for success as a boxer. At the time, boxing was not the organized sport that it is now and was actually outlawed in some places. Fighters often competed in unsanctioned one-on-one fights in illegal venues. Johnson racked up several wins in this category, as well as brutal free-for-alls with multiple fighters where the last person standing won prize money. I believe in living a healthy lifestyle, and as part of that, I'm curious about what athletes eat and how they train regardless of the sport. But I would describe myself as being just a casual boxing fan, in that I'm only interested in heavyweight boxing and usually only watch fights or clips of the handful of boxing superstars that I like. With that in mind, I appreciated seeing a bit of both in the documentary. As a fan of writing that has depth, I enjoy content that contains symbolism and double meanings that can be analyzed, or the analysis of symbolism and double meanings. So having the film break down the differences in how the media covered black and white boxers was of particular interest to me. There was an obvious racism where what would be applauded in white boxers would then be denigrated in black boxers. Stereotypes were applied to black boxers like Johnson, and incredible feats of mental gymnastics were used to explain away his obvious skill. When I first saw Unforgivable Blackness around the time of its release, I thought it was a cool documentary about the sport of boxing, but didn't take any interest in Johnson as a person. Watching Unforgivable Blackness again several years later with a bit more patience, I better understood Johnson's philosophy on life and had a greater appreciation for what he symbolized. Jack Johnson did not shuck and jive, nor did he see himself as a representative or advocate for black people. Also, as he gained fame and became financially successful, he developed a reputation for dating white women, which was like a no-go at the time. This was a different time, and while I don't think Johnson was ashamed to be black, he wanted the freedom to be his own person. He wanted to live life on his terms rather than within the bounds of what others considered acceptable, regardless of if they were black or white. He didn't deny that racism existed, but dealt with prejudice by treating everyone as though he was their equal, regardless of their race. He chose not to be a direct advocate for the black community, but instead used his actions to disprove the ideology of white supremacy within the realm of boxing. I think we have to make a distinction between people being part of the black community versus the property of the black community, meaning that it's perfectly fine to applaud and champion black people who achieve great things in life, yet as a community, we shouldn't expect to dictate how anyone else lives their life, as long as they're not doing anything illegal, especially if we as individuals wouldn't tolerate such interference in our lives. Quite often, when black athletes and entertainers are early in their career, much of their support comes from the black community, but some achieve a degree of popularity where they then cross over to the mainstream. They might come to regard themselves as being a great athlete or entertainer, period, rather than a great black athlete or a great black entertainer. For some, this might be a matter of feeling accepted by the white public and an attempt to put distance between themselves and other black people. But for others, it's a result of feeling as though they're now among the best of the best across the board, rather than the dismissive good for a black person. Though I do find it interesting that many black athletes and entertainers, especially those who rise from poverty, are initially surrounded by black people. Yet when they begin to achieve success, many are suddenly surrounded by white promoters, managers, women, etc. This has also happened with Black promoters and managers who've represented upcoming white artists. It would seem that when some Black artists and athletes reach a certain level of success, Black managers and representatives are deemed incapable of serving their interests. Not saying that was necessarily the case here with Johnson, but just that I noticed once he got to a certain point in his career, he was completely surrounded by white people. Not to mention, it's only in recent decades that we've begun to see Black people as coaches, in the front office of sports teams, or even as record label executives. I think sometimes we judge people out of context by basing our opinion of them on our experiences in the time in which we're living. Booker T. Washington promoted an accommodationist philosophy in response to white supremacy and was probably the most famous Black man of his time. Yet, despite the expectations of the time for Black people to be deferential towards white people, Johnson refused to kowtow. The point is made that some of this is a difference in attitude between those such as Washington, who'd been born during slavery, and those such as Johnson, who, were born free after emancipation. But I think it was simply a difference in opinion between two individuals, as there were certainly people in both groups whose opinions on the best way forward did not necessarily match up with the period during which they were born. So you had some slaves who were advocating for not just freedom, but also equality, and then, vice versa. It would be easy to assume that as an athlete who participates in a brutal sport, Johnson was himself a brute. This might have been true to a degree, and as he definitely handled business in the ring, yet he also joked around and was described as being fairly mellow outside the ring. And despite his limited formal education, he made it a point to read and educate himself. A glaring flaw that should indicate to anyone that white supremacy was built on a system of racial inequality is that it was easily threatened by an even playing field. If white supremacy was based on the natural order of things, then it would not have needed Jim Crow, black codes, and other crutches to survive. Newspaper clippings are read where journalists perpetuate white supremacy by stating various negative stereotypes about Black boxers. But then there are all kinds of excuses as to why white boxers shouldn't compete against Black boxers, despite supposedly being superior. I believe that racism and racial superiority comes from a place of inferiority. People as individuals range from bad to good, with most falling somewhere in between the two. You're doing way too much if you're using an unequal playing field while trying to convince me of your greatness. How could a white boxer fight only other white boxers and consider himself like the champion of the world or the best if they're also Black, Hispanic, etc. boxers? Unless you're willing to fight and face every and any reasonable contender in your weight class, you can't consider yourself a champion. This speaks to the real fear that fighting Black boxers meant there was a possibility of losing and thus having a Black boxer become champion, right? Like it does away with this concept of white superiority. It's like Hitler and the 1936 Berlin Summer Olympics, where you build up this ridiculous propaganda about a superior race and exhibit poor sportsmanship to keep the lie alive. In response, Johnson went easy on other Black boxers as due to the era, he had nothing to gain financially or with regards to notoriety by beating them. The white press and upper echelon boxers added to the hype of Johnson facing off against top-tier white fighters by making a big show of refusing the fights. Their racist explanations for why these fights shouldn't happen made them all the more meaningful when they finally did. Instead of letting Johnson fight whoever, and people, might talk about it for a day or two or whatever, they dragged things out and made the fights huge occasions that were significant. It showed the ridiculousness of the media coverage and the burgeoning fight industry's determination to prevent Johnson from fighting the white champion. Jim Jeffries, the white champ, went so far as to retire rather than fight Johnson. And then Johnson had to practically chase and goad the next white champ, Tommy Burns, into giving him a shot at the title. So the first fight between Johnson and Burns is crazy. Johnson plays mind games with Burns and gives him a beating for all that jive talking he and the press have been doing for years. And as is the documentary's theme, to point out the ridiculousness of the institution, white supremacy dictated that the knockout could not be recorded. Thus, the fight and recording was stopped before Burns could be completely knocked out. But he was getting dragged all about that ring. The mental gymnastics that people underwent to explain away not fighting Johnson and then to explain why Burns lost was amazing. It's one of those things where you just have to shake your head at the ridiculousness of it all. I'm always amazed by how scandalous people were back in the day. But yet there's this constant story about how reckless and devoid of character people are now. That's only because social media and television and whatnot weren't around like that to be into people's business. And learning about Johnson's lifestyle, it would seem that the boxing lifestyle of the past and sports in general seem to share a lot of the traits with the industry of recent years. Men from humble beginnings suddenly get large amounts of money and clothes, jewelry, fancy cars, and a starting lineup of women follow. Unfortunately, for a number of these individuals, they end up going broke, as most athletes tend to begin to physically decline in their 30s, but live a lifestyle based on the assumption that they'll be making the same kind of money for the rest of their lives. Ironically, the lifestyle that seems to surround boxing and other sports is unhealthy with all the, it requires a lot of discipline and whatnot to be successful in sports, but then it's surrounded by drinking, drugging, and womanizing. All hell broke loose when the public learned that Johnson was traveling with a white woman. Hotels, the press, and even black people back in Galveston turned their backs on him. It's interesting that at this time, black people were catching hell, but Johnson had some sense of privilege because of his title and fame. In collecting things such as clothes and cars, he sought out what was deemed top tier and exclusive at the time. It's sexist, but men also collect women to serve as symbols of their success. After the black woman he was seeing early in his career left him, it seems that he, just kind of dealt with whatever women were readily available in the sporting world. For some men, women are women, regardless of their race, and Johnson, being such a man, took advantage of the opportunity to be with white women. Given this era of white supremacy, where white women were placed on a pedestal, and it was forbidden for black men to be with white women, it likely added to their perceived value. Though, side note, most of the women Johnson dealt with seemed to be prostitutes. It's probably a factor of the times, but these women who were supposed to be young party girls in their 20s, they looked and dressed like school marms. They looked like somebody's nana. The Johnson versus Ketchel fight was amusing. You have to really be feeling yourself to take a shot at this guy that is knocking people out all about the place. Imagine a man is laughing and joking while fighting you, picking you up and carrying you around the ring. Be smart. Stay out of his reach and try to make it through the rounds without him cleaning your clock. But at the same time, I guess you have to give him an A for effort because he showed some heart in being willing to stand toe-to-toe with Johnson. Though it was like a fixed fight. It was just for fun, and he took it seriously. But I just shook my head when I saw Johnson mollywop Ketchel and knock him out cold. Dude took a nap in the ring. I like that with each fight, the focus wasn't just on the bout itself, but rather delved into the business and broader boxing history implications. The backstory around Johnson versus Jeffries is interesting from a business standpoint. It provided some insight into how revenues would be earned and royalties were to be split. That so much was riding on this fight is incredible. There probably were few, if any, fights like that in the history of boxing. I don't have any respect for Jeffries as a person, but as a fan of the discipline of athletes training, I did enjoy seeing the clips of his training camp. In a bit of irony, he might have been better off fighting Johnson years before in his prime, instead of being an idiot and retiring to avoid having to fight a black boxer. The Johnson versus Jeffrey fight lived up to the hype, as it was interesting to see Johnson patiently outbox and outwit Jeffries. Johnson's tendency to methodically and mercilessly beat white competitors should have been a warning of what to expect. The amount of racial significance attached to the fight was astounding. There was a constant refrain about the ineptitude and flaws of black people with regards to character, intellect, athleticism, and all other areas of life. Instead of allowing free rein to prove these theories, black people were held back and otherwise handicapped. When allowed to compete on an even playing field, we showed ourselves as being more than capable. And then instead of showing good sportsmanship after having their racist theories disproven in a fair fight, supporters of white supremacy responded to the loss with hostility and violence. It was a bit ironic that after having to push so hard to fight the world champion, who was white, Johnson then turned around and drew a color line of his own. In Johnson's case, the decision didn't seem to be racially motivated, but rather from a business and financial standpoint. Matches between black boxers at the time were not set up to be the moneymakers that they would become in later years. Thus, the fights had the potential to be harder while offering a smaller payday than if he fought white opponents. It remained easier, at least physically, and more profitable to fight white boxers. In some ways, the story of Jack Johnson reminds me of this theory of the sad laughing clown, constantly smiling while dealing with such open hostility would affect anyone. It's a bit sad that he endured all of these hardships to become champion and was still unable to enjoy it. Given that we're only just beginning to openly discuss depression, coverage of the topic within the larger Jack Johnson story was eye-opening. Johnson's domination of white opponents in the ring and audacity in his personal life outside the ring made a lot of people angry. With the enactment of the Mann Act, Johnson became a target, or the Mann Act allowed Johnson to become a target. Consider that federal agents traveled the country to gather information about him in hopes of bringing about a case that would stick. Yet during this same period, the federal government claims to not have jurisdiction and was somehow unable to provide resources to protect black people from lynchings or to enforce those civil rights in the South. Also, white men had been raping and otherwise assaulting black women for generations with no government intervention or judicial punishment, but yet they could find resources to hunt him down, because he's dating white women. Something to note about the era is that it's mentioned that Johnson was physically abusive with at least one of the women he was seeing. It says something that he wasn't arrested for domestic violence, but was arrested for allegedly transporting these consenting women across state lines. Was this a matter of the patriarchal society not yet having laws in place to combat domestic violence? And how was his dating a white woman worse than him being violent with any woman? To a degree, I understood Johnson's determination to continue seeing white women despite the risk. As long as the other person is an adult, why should you as a grown man have to deal with someone else telling you who you can be with? I believe that what takes place between two consenting adults is the business of those two consenting adults. So I don't have an issue with black men dating white women as long as they don't denigrate black women in the process, and vice versa. You might ask, if you're dealing with all this trouble, why continue seeing these white women who are bringing you unwanted attention? But I think to some degree it was an act of rebellion, a desire to live as he pleased and have all the things society said he shouldn't with regards to custom suits, custom cars, and whatever woman he was attracted to and was attracted to him. It's a factor of patriarchy, but men tend to use women as human representations of their achievements, akin to owning an exotic or luxury car. Not the stereotype, but in telling black men that they couldn't have these things, those become the things that they saw as being an achievement to obtain. And while Johnson might have been a good boxer, he didn't sound like much of a prize as a romantic partner, so black women were likely better off not dating him. Knowing what he went through, Johnson's loss suggests Willard was a tough fight to watch. There should be no shame in losing a boxing match, as it takes heart just to step into the ring. Any fighter, regardless of how good they might be, will eventually take a loss if they fight long enough and face good opponents. Not to make excuses, but the scheduled numbers of rounds for some of these fights is crazy. What kind of training do you have to undergo to last 45 rounds in a fight? And in 105-degree weather. Now, it can be argued that he likely lost because he didn't train well enough, had gotten older and grown comfortable in life, and his opponent was at the very least a decent, if not good fighter, 10 years his junior. Having lost the title at the age of 37 after boxing for over 2 decades, especially under these racially charged circumstances, is something to be proud of. Johnson might have been physically beaten and frustrated by his legal troubles, but was not broken. In all things considered, Willard was the better fighter that day and earned his win. Johnson's story would foreshadow many other fighters that came after. He earned a lot of money for the time, but ended up having financial issues within a short space of being unable to fight. Though in his case, it seemed to be due in part to his inability to get fights or make money doing shows, as much of the Western world turned its back on him due to his legal troubles and reputation with white women. Sadly, he was rumored to be reduced to fighting for a few $100s for a period. Though I hope that eventually athletes and entertainers will learn that these big paydays might not last a lifetime, and you have to put money up in case things go left. The same people glad-handing and cheering for you will be on to the next if you start losing or don't have money to throw about. I have nothing against Joe Louis, but it says something about him and the time that for a shot at moving up the ranks in titles, he had to be the anti-Jack Johnson. To read about all these rules and regulations that he had to follow to stay in the mainstream public's good graces was crazy. It reminded me of the book $40 Million Slaves and how so many athletes then and now are lions within their sport, but then absolute kittens with the media and public. They give up their voice and toe the line in exchange for a shot at financial gain. And then when the sport or the industry is done with them, they get thrown to the wayside all the same. But something I didn't understand throughout the film was the boxing attire in some of the photos and videos. I get it that boxing gloves and trunks have changed over the years, but men at that time were still wearing some kind of glove, shorts, and boots. Yet every so often, there'll be a clip of some fighter who would just inexplicably pop up in what appeared to be like a jock strap. Why is it that if one fighter is wearing shorts, the other person is boxing with both butt cheeks hanging out? Was this a shirts and skins kind of thing where it was a way to differentiate between the fighters? Was it a fighting strategy to throw the other boxer off? Either way, I thought it was weird and very distracting. Unforgivable Blackness is a documentary about Jack Johnson, but also about boxing's early history in America, as well as the racial climate of the time. Clocking in at 3 hours and 40 minutes is relatively long compared to other documentaries, but fairly short for a Ken Burns project. Either way, prepare yourself to settle in, as it will captivate your attention from start to finish. Despite the bulk of Johnson's story taking place during the early days of boxing, the documentary still features a wealth of black and white photographs and clips from Johnson's personal life, as well as highlight footage from fights. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more movie recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist.